This first half-hour conversation is really about us all getting on the same page and having some shared understandings around the ways in which we'll talk about mathematics intervention today. So that when we say intervention and you're thinking intervention in the context of this morning's session, that we're actually all talking about the same thing. Then the notion is that we have 3 stories from 3 different sites. And I guess the key aspect of that is it's not about being able to take one of those site stories back to your place. What we're wanting you to look for is what you see as the effective intervention strategies in those stories. But perhaps more importantly, given your role as leaders, what leadership actions do you actually hear? And which of those leadership actions do you reckon actually paid off for the sites as they tell their stories? And then the notion is, given how our timing goes, as we come back and try and pull that together. Can I just maybe start off by clarifying one aspect that came up in the ways that people were using language when they were sharing? We very carefully called this mathematics intervention. So I think one of the things that I'd encourage you to get sorted out, because people have used 2 different words this morning so far, are you here about mathematics intervention or are you here about numeracy intervention? Because the leadership actions attached to both of them would be very different. In the same way as Gaynor was talking about the leadership actions attached to focusing on intervening for fluency might be similar but related to the actions you might take to develop other aspects of mathematical development. Now, this notion of whether you're intervening for mathematics or numeracy, it's really clear. Australian curriculum defines it for us. So we don't need to talk about it, don't need to kind of wonder about which way it is. It clearly tells us. If you were here for numeracy intervention, we would be talking about how you could better help children use mathematics in other curriculum areas. Okay? That's how Australian curriculum defines it. So I guess we also have to think about that in relation to literacy and English. If you're doing literacy intervention, you would be intervening so children could use English powerfully in the other learning areas. If we're using Australian curriculum definitions, in both cases, if we're talking about English or mathematics, we're talking about what children are developing within those disciplines. So in our prior planning with SAPA and CSER together, we decided to deliberately target mathematics intervention. So intervening for children in relation to their progress and improvement with the mathematics learning area as described in the Australian curriculum. So that's, I guess, one interesting thing that's good to get clear in your own head about what you're wanting to do. Because with children, that's actually one of the things you often need to intervene with. Think about it. The Department for Education has a clear focus on learner agency. One of the aspects of learner agency, if I go back to the Australian curriculum, I think it's by year 2, the standard in the personal and social capability says that children would be able to identify what they already know, what they don't know yet, give you 2 or 3 suggestions about the way in which they could improve their own learning, put that into action and then reflect on whether it worked or not. So one of the challenges for us is, one of the conversations we want to have with children is, how powerful do you feel about your mathematics learning? What do you know about what do you not know yet? But we also want to do that in numeracy. So how do you feel as a mathematics learner? How do you feel as a numerate learner? Because they are actually 2 completely different skill sets. So the mathematics intervention, I guess, came out of some initial talking around the department's Literacy and Numeracy First document for principals that came out earlier this year, where it re-highlighted those conversations that were started with Results Plus. And the 2 we're particularly focusing on today, I guess, are the Expectation A and then how that leads to Expectation D. The issue, I guess, if I was sitting in a site as a leader at the moment would be, when I look at those 3 that are particularly determined as things that you might be wanting to intervene around, so children who are not meeting the standard for educational achievement, anyone who might be demonstrating low or no growth, and then children requiring support, does that capture everyone at your site that you would be wanting to intervene with? And some of that can be pretty tricky, the top one especially. As a system, the department is still grappling with that notion of being able to have cohesive sets of data about whether children are at the standard for educational achievement. I don't mean the second layer on the standard for educational achievement about the supportive data like PADM. I mean the top layer, which says that every child standard of educational achievement for the department is every child would be getting a satisfactory according to the achievement standard. So the challenge for us with that part is, do we have good data about that? How rigorous is that data? Is it data we can rely on? I've had a bit of a reporting week, I guess because it's that time of the term when educators get the reporting glaze. But if I just snapshot a whole pile of conversations, I don't know where they are, so I'm going to give them a C. At our school, we're not allowed to give E's. My principal won't let me give an E. D's the lowest we can go. Someone said, oh, they're 12 months ahead, so they're an A. The issue with that was that's the criteria from like 8 years ago. So I guess for me, this week, that top one I've been thinking a lot about in terms of if our job is to intervene for children who are not meeting the standard of educational achievement, how rigorous is the data that I've got in a site that we can use to make our decisions? As I said before, there is not one way forward. And I need to declare myself. I think the scariest thing that I heard this year was a department person talking about a single source of truth. I find that really confronting in education. When I studied education, it was about actually seeking a variety. Because I think a single source of truth would only work if we had a single child. But every child learns differently, every child needs a different pathway. So for this thing about lots of ways forward is why we chose to have 3 stories today, not 1. It's why we're talking about what elements would you focus on, not taking that and doing it in your place. The other lens, as I've said, is we want you to keep thinking about these things. What are the qualities of effective intervention, and what leadership actions can effectively drive improvement and innovation? The other thing we need to be clear on, and I agree with the document in this case, is it describes intervention as every action we take with and for learners to ensure learning growth. So I think that's really important to think about, because sometimes, and even perhaps in the way people were describing it at your tables, you're talking about it as an intervention program. Actually, it's about what are your intervention actions? And that's got to be a whole pile of things, one of which might be a particular intervention program. But we need to start from, I always say to the staffs I work with, every breath you take, every action you make are the things you have in your control to make a difference. All of those are interventions, and so we need to think intentionally about what it is that we're going to do. The department in their Numeracy First document talks about suggesting using the WAVE model. So that's the tack we're using today, but again, the wording in there is suggest, so you might also have things you want to add to that. One of the things I find intriguing, and it's quoted in that document, talks about in a school they think that 80% of children will benefit and have success by just accessing the WAVE 1 level of support. About 15% of children would need to access the WAVE 2, and 5% would be accessing WAVE 3. Now, I just reckon that's an interesting conversation. If I went back 2 slides, if it's about identifying the educational, whether children are meeting the standard of educational achievement, would that correlate? Agree? Disagree? Would it be similar for you at your place? Let's take that a step further now. So I guess our aim this morning is I'm going to take you through a brief think about each one of those waves, and then as you listen to the stories, you're going to hear in particular each of those stories talk about wave 1, wave 2, to a lesser degree wave 3 in terms of the actions that they've taken. So let's start with expectation A about tracking and monitoring learner growth as a mathematician. One of the things that I think we sometimes, we always try to simplify things, but learning's actually complex, and thinking and acting like a mathematician is really complex. I'm lucky enough to work with some kids on a regular basis, and I think one of the things, I always think it's like this amorphous blob. You act on this corner, and provide some kind of provocation that you're hoping will help a child grow. And often it's about seeing whether that gets you what you were looking for, but then you often need to step around and do it in a number of places to get where you're wanting to be. So I guess part of it for me comes back to, does your data set allow you to make powerful decisions about how to act? Because if thinking and acting like a mathematician is a complex process, where do my data sets sit? So the literature would talk about, certainly one of the data sets might be about what mathematics children know, what mathematics children can do, what mathematics children can understand and apply. Definitely that's going to be a data set I want to have a look at. But the other four, I would argue in mathematics, have a stronger role to play. And when I'm talking about learner dispositions, growth mindset is one of the ones that impacts, but it's not, in mathematics, often it's not so much, I'll take that back. I think it's more about how I see myself as a mathematician and the story of mathematics that children hold. So let's just, if I cruise around here, story of mathematics, what I mean is if you ask your children, what is mathematics? What is the most important thing about thinking like a mathematician? What would they say? I've done it 8 times this week already. Every single time children said numbers, adding up, taking away. Okay? Now, that's an issue in terms of children thinking about powerful mathematics, but it also has a big impact on their disposition and how they see themselves. So if you think that mathematics is about using numbers and you suck at it, what will your image of yourself as a mathematician be? Whereas I often talk with people about, what's your end game? You know, like at your place, what end game have you talked about with your staff at the end of the year? December the 14th, you've got the champagne out and you're kind of going, woohoo, we did a great job at learning and teaching mathematics this year. What would you be partying about? And I know that for me, some of that stuff is, I work at a couple of places long term, and so I know that I've had to answer that question. And for me, it's things like, if I can ask any kid anywhere and they tell me that mathematics is about being a pattern seeker, pattern solver, pattern finder, because mathematics is the science of patterns, rules and relationships, that's going to be a good thing. If they tell me that they are a mathematician and that how mathematics to their matters in their lives, if they can also tell me that thinking like a mathematician has nothing to do with getting an answer, thinking like a mathematician is all about having a theory and creating a proof. So if you're being a powerful mathematician, you have a capacity to notice things, generalise those rules, patterns and relationships, and then be able to test out and to prove them and convince the other people around you. Now, can you see that completely changes children's dispositions? Because it's the idea, I might suck at remembering the number names or knowing every algorithm for addition, but if I know how to notice, generalise, visualise, express my theories and convince other people of my thinking, then I'm a long way towards being a powerful mathematician. Because actually, most of those other things are now Googleable. I don't know if you've played, but there was a new app a month ago. If you don't know how to count, you just hold it over the top of something and it tells you how many. If you don't know how to add, you just write it down and hold it over the top and it does it for you. So, and don't get me wrong, in an ideal world, children will be powerful with those things because they're kind of menial mathematics. But they're not the things that make children powerful thinkers and powerful users of mathematics. If you haven't read it, there's a great book called The Mathematician's Lament, written by a mathematician called Paul Lockhart. And he writes about, it's a mathematician's lament because his basic comment is, why do schools spend all their time doing menial mathematics that makes no difference? What he's arguing for from a mathematician's point of view is what we were talking about before. So I guess here the issue is, if we go back, if your job is to track and monitor learners' growth, which of those domains are you tracking and monitoring it in? Because if you're going to act, we need data sets that allow us to talk about all of those things. Maybe it's worth just for a minute or two, have a chat. Which ones of those would you have, and which ones do you use to make decisions? And if I just give an example, I had a school earlier this term who'd done amazing stuff collecting disposition surveys and had all this data about children changing their image of themselves as mathematicians, but they were doing an intervention program, and the only thing they looked at was Padim, something about the bottom box. And yet, they weren't looking at the interplay between those two. Like, is there a correlation between how I feel about myself as a mathematician and the results I achieve? Is there a correlation between the connections I see between mathematics and other things in the world and which of the knowing, doing and understanding I'm most powerful with? Couple of minutes, have a chat. Which of those do you have data sets about? And do you think they're all important? Two things come out of that, I guess. One would be, if I look at that list and think, oh, well, you know, I've got that data set at our place, but that one I don't have, but I'm not sure where to start. Maybe that would be one of the outcomes you want to pass on to us. We're going to ask you to give us to give us an exit ticket as you leave today. Just that notion of what message do you want to give. That might be one of the things you want to follow up about. So what, if you did want to have all of those data sets, what are some of the tools that actually help you collect that? And what have different things people done with them to be able to use them in powerful ways? The other thing I just want to note is that if I think of the 3 sites that are telling their story today, all of them have dealt with those data sets. In terms of, in each site, it may not come through in the stories today because it's not their brief, but I can tell you without a doubt, each of them started by focusing on getting a coherent story of mathematics, so that every child at their place was building consistent and congruent pictures of what that was. So if we look at the wave 1, 2, 3, wave 1 is that notion of, if we change, and I really like, this is a quote from, it is the department's current strategy still in terms of the numeracy powerful learners strategy. There's a quote in there that talks about what we need to change is the lived experience of every child in every learning session every day. So our best intervention action is actually going to be to have high quality educators who are able to drive mathematics learning and with every child, isn't it? So wave 1 is absolutely critical if you're thinking about your intervention actions. In fact, I'd argue you're going to get much more bang for buck in that domain than you might in wave 2 even, because it's going to affect every child every day. Some of the things with that, I guess, is that idea about what's the relationship between your learner data set and your educator data set. So, and if I explain what I mean, so you've got information about some or all of that. Do you correlate it with your educator data? So does the fact that children have some knowing and understanding that they are not yet on top of correlate to the same area that educators would say they don't feel on top of or fluent with? Does the dispositions of your children directly correlate to the dispositions of your adults? Does the story of mathematics that your adults have correlate to the story of mathematics that your children have? In terms of the educator data set, I'd say these are probably the 4 domains for me. And it's interesting in terms of, so dispositions to mathematics. I've kind of needed alcohol twice this term, only because in a couple of different places I asked the question about, because they were talking about intervention, what is it? Do you believe every child has the capacity to be a successful mathematician? Okay, does every action you take actually underpin that? So at your place, no one ever says the word high learner, low learner, ever, because it's not a high learner or low learner, would it be? It would be that they're at a higher entry point currently, but they're not a high learner or a low learner. Those two, because for me it's a bit of an oxymoron. There's all this language attached to high and low learners, but we talk about growth mindset. Growth mindset would be the antithesis of that, would it not? If we genuinely believe every child can be a successful mathematician, we wouldn't be using language or organising children in ways that actually define them by the ability that they have. So I know the challenge for me was, because I was kind of on a roll, yes, do you believe every child can be a successful mathematician? And at these 2 locations, people went, nah. And I was like, oh. And I told my story about, the girl in the UK where they cut out half her brain. She was fitting, the medical solution was to remove one hemisphere. So she lost function on one side of her body and almost all her speech, etc. Within 3 weeks, her brain had started to regrow. And by the end of the year, there were no ill effects other than a slight limp. So Stanford Uni, when I first worked with them like 5 or 6 years ago, they were using that as their evidence. And that what they would say is simply, hey, if you can grow half a brain, why do we act like children can't grow the few neurons they need to understand algebra? So the challenge I found was I'd told that story, which usually works, but people were still saying, no, you're either born like a mathematician or you're not. So I guess the issue is, what do your staff really think? Not what they just tell you out loud, but how do they describe that? And for me, it's listening for those cues. Anyone says high or low? The kids who can, the kids who can't? There's a whole repertoire of language we have that would say that actually maybe those things are not in place. The one on the right, I'm really old, so I'm wise enough to remember lots of interventions within the department. We've focused on that a number of times in terms of, we just need to fix people's maths understandings up. Now, if you're doing it to them, that's a definition for it not working. It's not that that's not important. The two scariest things I know for a fact, no teacher in South Australia can tell you the difference between capacity and volume. In another of the associations I'm involved in, Primary Maths Association, we actually did a survey. 8,000 teachers, not one of them could describe the difference between capacity and volume. Now, it's not that that's the most important piece of mathematics, but actually I know it's on the list for every year level, so probably it would be important. So if I was saying people didn't tell the difference between a noun or a verb, would we worry about that? And the other one, I guess, that comes up all the time, which relates a little bit to the stories you're going to hear today, in reception there's a content description that says that children need to learn the rules for the counting system. So if you want to test your staff out, just ask 2 questions. At your place, do you use the same alphabet in English? And they'll look at you like you're crazy. Of course we use the same alphabet in English. The parallel question is, does everyone teach the same list of rules for the counting system? And can you write them down? Now, there's lots of different lists, doesn't matter whose you're using, but there's about 20 rules. The question would be, does everyone at your place have those? Or is one of the reasons that children are needing Wave 2 intervention because actually every year children are only getting access to learning 5 letters of the 26-letter alphabet. So I guess the question is around the correlation between the two. Again, 2 minutes. Do you have data sets? Particularly the bottom one, because for me the bottom one's important. What you'll hear in each of the stories today are sites where they've focused on the knowing. So do teachers have powerful understandings of mathematics? Do they have strong dispositions and a strong story of mathematics? But one that they've then worked on is they've worked on the craft, because it is a craft. You can't buy a project, you can't buy online the capacity to run a successful mathematics learning session. It is a craft that people hone by working with their colleagues, watching their colleagues, having a chance to get performance and observational feedback. So that craft one is really important to look at. 2 minutes, do you have sets related to those? And do you line it up and correlate it with your learner data? We've said Wave 1 is about the most powerful intervention of all, intervention to change the lived experience of every child. In the Numeracy First document, it talks about that. Obviously, a lot of that will come through professional learning. And I guess if we were looking at those things that are potential pitfalls, I think the greatest gift to me as a leader is the fact that I get to, with educators, frame professional learning pathways. So what I have to think about it is when we frame professional learning, it's our opportunity to model the learning process. So if as a leader I choose to make all children learn all adults learn at the same time in the same way on the same day about the same topic, what message and permission have I just given to the educators I work with? That learning works best when you all do it in the same way on the same day on the same topic about the same thing. It's my one opportunity as a leader to model that that's actually not right. So a key pitfall is no differentiation. If you've got educator data set, what does it tell you about people's entry points? How would you then craft, let's talk about your craft as a professional learner, provider, creator, how would you provide differentiated pathways for educators that take them from where they are to where they want to be or where your agreed goals are? I think the other pitfall in South Australia is that we do people. Like, I'm so old, I can make a really long list of everyone's done. Like, everyone did George, then they did Michael, then they did, right? And currently we've done Anne and we're doing Tierney. All of those people have fantastic resources. But if any one of them had the solution, wouldn't we all be doing the one? What happens is we do people. And then when that person doesn't work, we do the next people. You know, the scariest thing I've seen is partnerships where they spent 3 years doing one of those people and then they just flip-flop to another one. Like, where's that going? So the notion of doing people, I reckon, listen to yourself. If I asked you, how are you improving mathematics at your place? If the words come out of your mouth, we're doing, it's a prime thing for me to think about. And it's not so much maybe you, but think about what your teachers would say. If they'd say we're doing, then that's an issue in itself. Because we want to actually do all of those people. They've all got great stuff. There's all fantastic things coming out all the time, but we want to be actually creating that pathways, differentiated pathways. The other one I think is a potential pitfall is evidence-based. Evidence-based, research-based, currently trendy two terms, but let's think about that. Evidence-based in itself is a bit of oxymoron because it's the best of what was, not the best of what could be. Also, and I don't know if you've seen it, I chose not to flash it up, but I'm happy to share it. And this is not a comment, it's just for you to think about. Our job as educators in mathematics, in data, is to help people learn how to critique. What does this say? What does this say? What does this say? How does that, and then what do they balance against each other? For me, it comes back to why I feel so strongly about the single source of truth. The issue with evidence-based is whose evidence? And whose are you going to listen to? There's a couple of big reports, I'm not sure if you've seen them this year, that one only came out again last week, but worldwide there is a huge pushback on Haddie. So from a mathematician's point of view, the two big things this year is that statistically effect sizes are invalid. So from a mathematician's point of view, effect sizes don't hold up. Now, so there's another piece of evidence for you, two sources this year alone. Now, it doesn't mean I'm going to discard what's in that, but it means I need to compare and contrast, doesn't it? And I think what all of our organisations are starting to talk about is not so much evidence-based. I don't want to know what the best of what was. I want to learn from it, but I actually need to create of the best of what will be. So evidence-informed, or even evidence-inspired might be a great idea, mightn't it? Because we probably haven't even imagined the best possible way to help children become powerful learners of mathematics. So the things we know work: educator agency, educators having control over their own learning pathways, that there's multiple pathways and that we stay the distance. In the stories you're about to hear, you'll hear these people stay the distance. They don't have a priority for a year or 2 years. They hang in for 4 or 5. That's what the evidence actually shows. Any improvement's going to take 4 to 5. Do we hang in? Now, I can be controversial because I don't work for anyone. So the issue in our world is that we live in a world governed by a political cycle where no one hangs in for that long. So if that's what's happening up there, how do I, as a site leader, actually manage that to stay the distance? A couple of quick things before we move to the stories. Wave 2, because you're going to hear a lot of this. The key question is, what are you going to intervene for? And where is your bang for buck? Which one of those are you going to intervene around? Which one will get the most change, most improvement, and therefore have the most impact on children's learning lives? And initially, I'd probably argue it's the disposition and stories of maths. It's also about, you hear in the stories that you're about, from each site, that they very clearly targeted what they were going after. Very specific, so that they could both measure it and decide what they're doing. So it needs to be targeted, it needs to be timed, short duration. Any longer than 6 weeks, if you've had no improvement in that time, it would be the definition of, what's Einstein's? Doing the same thing over and over again without getting improvement. So targeted, timed, and terminating. Children need to get off intervention in wave 2. And the other thing I think we don't talk about at all, there's a big thing at the moment in the department about learner agency, but often in intervention they don't have any. They're not invited to come to a place to improve their mathematics learning. They're not invited to set the mathematic goals that they're wanting to achieve while they've got access to whatever that thing is you're going to give them. So for me, there's a bit of lack of congruence between learner agency except when we're trying to intervene, which is actually the time at which it would be most important. Because year before, we interviewed 500 kids who were in intervention programs and said, why do you go to intervention? Like, why do you go with Mrs. So-and-so? Because I'm dumb at maths. Across the board, without fail. They loved going, absolutely loved going, that's not the issue. But before they got there, they were thinking they were dumb at maths. So if we know that there's a correlation between what I think and what I can do, can you see the issue? Key question, what percentage of children would you have identified in wave 2 before you actually think, this is not wave 2, this is wave 1? I've seen a few sites across the state where they've got huge numbers of children who actually need to go into wave 2 intervention. What that tells me is no wave 2, we need to intervene for every child. Let's put our money and investment and time into that. Wave 3, so that intensive and personalised support. How many children is this? And I mean how many children in mathematics, not children who have a communication or language issue who end up in mathematics intervention because they can't talk about mathematics. It's really interesting. It would be nearly 5 years ago, we did a mapping of IEPs and how many times mathematics was mentioned in them. Hardly ever. No accommodations and adjustments around mathematics. Usually it just says they need help to read the question. And there's a few things in there that are of issue, as if mathematics is about reading questions. So is mathematics really the issue? And I think in this section, it's that notion of, am I coming forever? And for some children, they're entitled to additional learning support forever. But how do we frame that with them so that we get learner buy-in? It's like, here's your bonus adult. You can use them to become the most powerful learner. How would you choose to use them? Not, it's 11:20, time to go with so-and-so. And it needs to be different, not more of the same. In mathematics, what we most see is kids being withdrawn to do the crappiest of mathematics learning challenges. Like it's often, there's a practice in mathematics that's interesting. Someone said there's an article out of the US where they talk about it's like you take the worst practice and then just take them away and make them do it in small groups over and over and over and over again. This group of children needs something different. In a world where I don't need, something will count for me, something will add for me, what are the powerful skills that this group in particular need to be powerful mathematicians? Because they might be entirely different to those children in wave 2 or wave 1. And if it looks like what they're doing in class, is it, in fact, an intervention? And what I was meaning there is that it's learning targeted to make them powerful in their context. What do they need to be a powerful mathematician? So what we want you to have the opportunity to do now is to learn from others' stories. And Gaynor, I guess I was reflecting on what you were talking about in terms of the fluency versus the proficiencies. SAPA and CESA chose, in terms of determining site stories, to pick up 2 of the department's priorities. So in numeracy first, there are 4 numeracy priorities for action. One is inquiry. Okay, so children having access to inquiring into mathematics. Second one is building number sense. Third one is developing visualising. And the fourth one is generalising for abstraction. Now that last bit is what I was talking about before, that mathematics is about noticing patterns, rules and relationships, being able to generalise them, like go, I think this will always happen, and then put them into action. So the site stories you're going to hear today very much come from these two aspects. I think there's lots in their story where they're doing that with a view to also improving proficiencies, but that will be an interesting one for you to keep your lens on. So on your table, there's just some A4 pieces of paper that just have some boxes on it. It's really only to frame your listening and engagement in the site stories, but it asks you to think about what qualities of effective intervention do you hear? What leadership actions do you hear? And then what kind of things is that making you think about? So the first site we're going to invite to come and share with us is, so the three stories we have are Mawson Lakes, and then Belair Primary School, and then Cowandilla Primary School. We'll introduce each set of people as they come. Can I in advance thank them? Because I think originally they were asked to come and speak to like 20 or 30 people. And then they've walked into today and it's slightly more than that. So we thank them in advance. So can I introduce Sue Lemmer and Wendy Connor from Mawson Lakes School. I'll let you two kind of talk about who you play with and what you do as you're doing it. Happy with that? Welcome.
Thank you. Just a bit of background, I guess. I'm the Deputy Principal and my job is coordinating intervention, and Wendy is one of our team of SSOs that currently works across years 3 to 7. When Mr Jane asked us to come along and talk to about 20 people and share a few ideas, we came along thinking, she said to us, can you share what you do? And what we do changes week by week. So I can't actually tell you what we do because it will be different next week. But what I thought we would do is do a quick tour through where we've been and why we've made some changes and what we're currently thinking. And underpinning that is lots and lots of mistakes and lots of failure. And we're quite pleased about that because that shows that we're getting better. So we talked to our staff about, can everyone learn maths? And the answer was a resounding no. Teachers had that set that some kids were good at maths, some kids would never learn it, and certainly kids on NEPs were never going to be any good, so it wasn't really worth trying to push them. So that's a huge issue for us as leaders in terms of how we deal with that. I need to explain I've got a shocking cold at the moment, so my voice is going to come and go. In terms of intervention and what we've done, the usual things, we looked at NAPLAN data, we looked at PATM, and we also spoke to teachers and to SSOs working with teachers and asked them about which students should be in an intervention program and why. Most of the responses we got was, yes, they need maths intervention. When we said why, because they're not good at it. What do you think that program should focus on? Well, just maths. If you could just take them and work on their maths. So it wasn't terribly helpful, but it was an indication of where we were at as a site, and that raised some good questions for us. We chose initially to go with big ideas in number. The reasons for that is NAPLAN is over 2 years, PATM is over a year. We wanted some data that would help us to drill down and I guess reassure us that we were making progress. It's reasonably quick to administer and several of us had had previous experience with it, so it seemed like an option we might want to pursue. In terms of who we targeted, I'm not going to show you the spreadsheet because there's no way you'd be able to see it. But basically, we tested all of the kids in the school, from reception with Trust Account and from year 2 with Place Valley. We developed an amazing spreadsheet that could tell us how many in a class had or didn't have each part of the Trust Account data, we colour-coded it so that it showed a difference as each child made progress. We had an intervention program that was short-term, 3-week turnaround, and then we retested. At the same time, we had Quick Smart because everybody else was having it and it seemed like a good thing to do. And it was highly recommended, so we signed up for 3 years. I guess we're up to some of the things we noticed. We thought we had a reasonable intervention program in place. What we found out was that students were not actually being stretched. They were focusing on really explicit part of place value. There was a huge mismatch between what was happening in intervention and what was happening in classrooms. So often there's no correlation in terms of ideas, thoughts about what mathematics was. We were making lots of assumptions about classrooms. We were assuming that teachers had some understandings and were doing some things. And we started to get that horrible sense of sticking a finger in a dike. And it really was a Band-Aid approach, and at one stage we had 65% of our kids needing intervention. You know, when it gets to that sort of percentage, I think you have to stop and think very carefully about what you're doing as a site and why all of those kids are being placed into an intervention program. So what we talked to staff about was, let's slow down. With Quick Smart, it was about fluency. It was about making kids practicing with flashcards and getting quicker at reciting the tables. We were getting, in terms of effect size, effect sizes of close to 3. Hattie talks about 0.4. So it would have been very easy to pat ourselves on the back and say, wow, we're doing a fantastic job here. But in reality, that wasn't being taken back to the classroom. Students weren't applying that in learning. And often they didn't see any connection between the Quick Smart program and the classroom. So that was a real concern for us. So as a staff, we encouraged staff to look at mathematics differently. 12 staff enrolled for the Joe Bowler course and did that online course together, and leadership did it with them so that we could talk about that and bring some of that back to staff meetings. We spent probably 6 months looking at the 8 effective practices of mathematics and picking and looking at what we currently do well, but also what we're not doing. So where are our opportunities to improve? It was about that time, I think, that Wendy and 2 other SSOs went off and did a workshop with Lisa Jane.
Myself and Heidi, one of the other SSOs, originally went to a Lisa Jane workshop designed for SSOs about language in maths. We came back telling Sue how amazing it was and how it was all common sense and why weren't we all thinking that way, but presumed that that's what the teachers were already doing and that as SSOs we just didn't have the knowledge. We then went again the next year with another SSO and attended pretty much the same workshop, but this time aimed at teachers and linking to the curriculum, and then realised in the room that it was news to most of them as well. So sort of then felt a little bit better that it wasn't only us that didn't have the knowledge, that a lot of the teachers were working without the knowledge as well. So then came back to Sue and said, we really have to start talking about this. We were presuming that everyone knew what they were doing and then realised that that's why our wave 1, I guess, wasn't working, because the teachers just didn't have the knowledge that they needed. We certainly didn't have it up until then. So I think that's where we've come from with now working with Lisa to try and help teachers to understand more about mathematics.
So we just had a slide here which I think was guiding light, I think, for us. And that when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. We were so engrossed in our intervention program that we couldn't actually see what was happening. We were trying to include more and more kids in the program. We were becoming increasingly concerned that there was no relationship between intervention and classroom practice, and we thought we had to do something a little bit different. We'd had quite a big focus on number sense because I used to pull out questions from NAPLAN and take them to staff meeting at the beginning, give teachers 5 minutes to have a go at one of the questions and tell us what they'd done. And it was when a teacher had done some quite involved calculations to prove that two fractions, I'm going to simplify it with what we did yesterday, 1/3 and 1/5, to prove which one was bigger. And teachers couldn't actually tell me. And I was quite frightened by that because I'd just seen, given those two fractions, they would be able to tell me why without having to do a calculation. From then on, the questions I chose for staff meeting were very much about number sense. And we found lots of questions in NAPLAN where if you have a very strong number sense, you can actually solve the question without doing any calculating at all. Just knowing how numbers work and being able to see the patterns. So teachers became scared, I guess is a good word. A lot of teachers came up to me and said, I'm beginning to realise that what I'm doing is not right. I'm beginning to realise there are some gaps in what I'm doing. I'm beginning to realise that some kids don't get it, but I don't know what to do about it. So that was the time when we actually found our missing wave. And that wave was the wave 1 intervention. And we'd been so engrossed in our intervention program, we hadn't taken the time to step back and look at the big picture. Once we did that and looked at it differently, it was obvious that what we needed to do was pay attention to the wave 1, and hopefully that make a difference to the waves 2 and 3. So this year we're working with Lisa Jane, and all of our staff are released for half a day in year level teams to build their knowledge of mathematics. The conversations have changed. Teachers talk about mathematics at recess and lunch times. They're excited about it. They're sharing. They're quite brave in saying, I don't know how to do this. I didn't know what that meant. You should have seen what this child did in my class today. It really has changed that headset. So what we've done this year is a new beginning again. We actually started it, we thought about it towards the end of last year and decided we'd put it into place this year, particularly as we had a student agency focus. So we interviewed every student that was currently on an intervention program, and it's quite a lot of students. We asked them why they were on an intervention program, and most of them said they really had no idea, but they assumed it was because they weren't very good at maths. We showed them their data. We asked them if anyone had ever shown them their data before and what they thought that data might be telling them. We asked them about what made them feel good about mathematics, but also what made them feel uncomfortable about mathematics. And we asked them how they wanted to move that learning forward. And I guess for some of those kids said they don't want to be an intervention. And do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so through those interviews with the kids, we had a lot who said, we love coming to intervention, and the data showed that I can get better, that I can improve, and we thought that was really positive to work with them. But working with the idea of agency, just asking the kids how they wanted intervention to happen. And a lot of them sort of wanted their cake and eat it too. They want us to be there to help when they need it, but not to come and do it to them like 3 times a week. And that was sort of a lot of kids said that. Sue was able to help us with timetabling to free up some spaces, because we realised at the end of term 1 we had so many kids on intervention that we couldn't move. So all we were doing was pulling them out and working through and pushing them back in again. No time to look at what they've done. So we've managed to basically adjust timetables where we have room now to go, well, I was working with this kid this morning and he found that really hard. You know, he's not one that I normally work with. Could we get together later on maybe and work through together? We're at the stage now we can actually say to the kids, how do you feel about this? Would you like to come and talk to me later on this afternoon and we can maybe go over it again? And they're able to say, oh, that'd be great. So to go away from that, I suck at maths and I'm dumb at maths, to go, I'm usually pretty good at maths, but I found this hard. Can I come and talk to you about it? Has been, I think, really empowering for us as SSOs to actually feel like you're making a difference where the kid needs it, rather than just going, well, I'm just going to do some fluency stuff here for half an hour and then send him back in. He's not fixed. He's now more confused. So that's been massive. The way SSOs work in our school has changed a lot. We're setting up now drop-in times where kids know we're available to come and talk to us about what they're finding hard, trying to connect what we're doing in intervention with what they're doing in the classroom. So they were coming to us and we're just doing number work, and they go back into the classroom and they're doing fractions and nothing's sort of connected. So now they can say, oh, well, this is what I was doing this morning. I don't quite get what was happening here. I think part of doing the discussing, you know, as we are with Lisa Jane, has helped with the story of mathematics. I think a lot of the SSOs were giving that message of, I'm really not very good at it either, so I'm going to just do this with you. I think our story has changed, and I think we're giving a different story to the kids.
Yeah, in those conversations that we have with students, we're trying to free up more and more time for SSOs, as Wendy said, to just drop in when they need it. But underlying that, we still have those kids that are coming out regularly to work with us. But what we do with them in that time has changed quite dramatically. So we've asked kids, what is your most pressing and urgent need right now in mathematics? And we're working with whatever those kids tell us right now, because we need to build their confidence, we need to build that engagement. What I found the other day was I'd asked a student who wanted to focus on multiplication, and we're looking at whether or not the order of the numerals made a difference. And she wasn't sure about that. So I asked her to think about what you see when you see 3 times 4. What are you seeing in your head? And she stopped for a while and she said, absolutely nothing. And she said, I'm trying to make a number, but the number's just not there. And I actually didn't want to see a number. I wanted to see something, some objects or a situation. So we've been playing around with creating situations and talking about where multiplication fits in all of that. And a couple of days later, she said, I can see in my head. And I said to her, is it colour or is it black and white? And she said, oh, it's colour. And there's lots of colours. And what she's doing now is whenever we do something, she'll say to me, can I just visualise that? And she stops and thinks, and then I'll ask her to record that in some way and talk to me about what she's seeing. She's made heaps of progress because now she can actually see it. And she's making connections and saying, well, when I saw this, it was like when I saw that. And I can now make a pattern and see those patterns. I think as a school, we'd really moved away from patterning, and it's something that has become very obvious as a school that patterning is at the heart of everything we do. So we're strongly encouraging teachers and working with them that whatever aspects of mathematics you're doing, look for the patterns in it. Help the kids to see those patterns and talk about how those patterns pop up in other aspects of mathematics. And I think that's really, I was working with a child yesterday that'd been struggling with fractions, and he suddenly said, I've got it, I've seen the pattern. And he'd been struggling to show me what a half meant, and we'd been around and looked at things in the school and talked about halves. We talked about when you use them. And yesterday he suddenly said, I get it now. And I get that you can make a half with different pieces. So halving a half is a quarter, and halving a quarter is an eighth, and halving an eighth is a 16th. And he was so excited that he had that understanding and can use it. And he said to me, is all maths about patterns? And I thought, we've got one. We just need to work on the other 799 kids. So it's a long journey. And our last slide is just about some of the resources that I think have helped us along the way. We meet regularly as a team with the SSOs to talk about how it's going. We work very closely with teachers and provide them with the information we're collecting. We used to update our spreadsheet every 3 weeks. Now we're actually using the numeracy continuum because we figured that that continuum is there. Teachers need to become aware of it and be using it. And if students can actually move forward in their numeracy learning, we're making that assumption that the mathematics is moving forwards too, because we've turned the continuum into an I can continuum for students. We're getting them to plot where they currently see themselves on the continuum, and we're providing then the mathematics that backs that up so that they can get stronger in actually applying it in everyday life. So that's where we are.
Can I ask you to thank Sue and Wendy and the Mawson Lake Story? Can I introduce Leanne, Kerry and Kate from Belair Primary School? And again, they'll tell you what they do and who they play with as they introduce their story.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Leanne Twigden and I'm currently the principal of Belair Primary School. We're a Category 7 school, and as such, you would expect a high-performing school. And we certainly get 80% of our children who reach standard educational achievement. We also get a high percentage of children in the higher bands in Year 3. What our data shows very alarmingly is that we lose a huge amount of those by the time they get to the Year 5. So that for us was a very big concern that we needed to focus on. As a result of that, clearly the Wave 1 intervention that Lisa Jane was just talking about does certainly fit with us. The 80% of our children who, in the general sense, are achieving are the ones that we believe we really needed to focus on to be able to show that they could retain the higher bands that we were seeing in Year 3. We've been embarking on whole school professional learning over the last 3 years. Historically, the school has worked on mathematics in a number of ways, but the last 3 years we have become much more targeted with a view to identifying what we believe is good practice for us, but also identifying practice that we know needs to be consistent across our school, ARTA 7, to be able to build the learning for children every year. We have also, within the last 6 months, come to some reasonably common agreements about what our site will offer for all children, and that's around consistent language, but also a consistent understanding of what processes of counting and calculating look like, and what aspects of those children need to be really familiar with. So what we've done today is I'd like to introduce Kate LaJoy, who is a Year 4 teacher and who has been working with us over the last 3 years, and then aspects of the work that Kerry has been doing as an SSO with the intervention that we've taken in terms of Wave 2 for this year. Kate?
Okay. So when I started looking at mathematics with my class, what I noticed was that when kids came up against a situation that needed some resolving, they didn't know what to do. They went, I don't get it. I don't get it. And it was overwhelming for them, and it was quite honestly overwhelming for me. I'm not quite sure I know where to start either. So we looked at, if they needed to quantify, so we were looking at processes of calculating. What am I going to have to do? Do I need to, do I estimate, approximate? How accurate am I going to need to be? Do I need to count? Do I need to calculate? If I do, there are some questions I have to ask myself. Which operation am I going to use? Or which operations will I use? Can I do that in my head? Will I be doing it on paper, or can I use technology to do that? So those were the questions we looked at and we talked about over and over and over and over. So when we came up with a situation that happened in class, happened on anywhere, in an assembly, whatever it was, I'd say to them, I don't want to know the answer. What would you do first? What are those questions you're going to ask yourself? So for the kids that I was teaching, it changed the focus already about the right answer. It was about, what am I trying to do? How am I going to go about doing it? We used real life situations. We used what kids were doing. Something happened in the playground. We didn't get equal time on the handball court, whatever, those kinds of things that came back in after lunch or came from home or came up in planning a trip where our swimming water safety program, how much time will we need to get there on the bus, how much time is our lesson, those kinds of things. We pulled them apart as a class, all those real life things that kids could then have an impact and say, we're going to solve it this way, we're going to decide on this. Those real life things, familiar contexts that they were doing. My brother and I don't have the same amount of time to play on the PlayStation. All those kinds of things that would come up. Real life matters to me. We used easy to manage quantities, little bits of stuff. For example, this one that I've got on the bottom, we've got the 24 chairs in the classroom, 27 students. Easy to manage, real, made sense to them, and we did it. We did them over and over and over and over. Anytime it came up, we'd stop and we'd go, right, this is one of those things where we're going to have a look at it. What are those questions we're going to ask ourselves? Why will we do it in our head? Why would we do it on paper? Why would we do it with technology? What am I looking for? So, the learning challenges, not finding the answer, it was hard. I know. I got it. I don't care, I don't want to know it. We're not doing the answer. And they would say to me after a while, oh, Kate, are we not doing the answer? Can we do the answer? So every now and again, I'm like, okay, here's an answer, do an answer. But what are you doing? I want you to look at the process. What questions do you ask yourself? Can you find the quantities we're talking about? And some of them couldn't. What are we talking about? You've got 24 chairs and I've got 13. What are we talking about? What are the quantities? What is the operation? Am I going to be getting myself more or less? What are we actually going to have to do? And then, what will my answer be about? What kind of thing? Are we talking about the number of minutes? Are we talking about distance? Are we talking about how many lollies I get? What are we actually going to talk about? Because often what kids came up with as an answer didn't have anything to do with what they were trying to find out. So then we're asking the questions about, does that make sense? Is that reasonable? Would that be right? And sometimes they'll go, yeah, I think so. And other times they'd be, whoa. We got to the point where it was, well, that can't be right. Or, yeah, I think that looks about right. Then I had my students write their own situations. So it was go home, talk about things, what comes up over the dinner table, talk to mum and dad, what are the kinds of things that you use mathematics, where we use mathematics, because they didn't realise, I think, a lot of the time where they were doing it and why they were doing it. So we wrote them. We collected them, and then there was a pot of them, a box of them, kids could go and take them, read them. And sometimes it was someone hadn't written one very clearly, so there were those questions. This doesn't tell me what I'm trying to find out. This doesn't identify the quantity. So that was all really good thinking and reasoning stuff going on there. Then I was working with a mentor, and we did trialling, explicitly taught algorithms for addition. This is, I think, addition and subtraction. Teaching them, what are the different strategies? Some of them work for some people, some of them don't. Some kids go, that just doesn't make sense. I don't get that. That's too hard. And I had one when we were doing multiplication that blew my mind, and I just looked at it and I said, there's no way I'd ever do that. That's way too tricky, but the kids loved it. Chunking and doing all this weird stuff. They were like, this makes so much sense. So kids got to explore, to experiment, to practice, and then I asked them to commit to one. This is the one you've chosen, the algorithm that you're going to use, you've said. We put our names up on the board, their preferred algorithm. They were free to change it at some point, but they had to be able to explain why. I don't like this method anymore, I prefer this, and these are my reasons. So they committed to using that strategy and practicing. They could teach other kids if other kids weren't sure, that we had a kind of bit of peer tutoring going on. So that was good practice, and they came to really understand that there are different ways of doing things, and it is about what makes sense to you. There's no point doing it over and over if you don't understand what it is you're doing. We talked about, we came up with some class rules. For this one was, when would you use a mental calculation strategy, when would you use a written one? We decided when there were large quantities. So 3, 4, 5 digits, they said that's too big to hold in your head, so that's when I would do it. If there's more than 3 add-ins. The other one was how confident I feel. If I don't feel confident doing it in my head, I'm writing it down. Go for it, that's great. If it feels too hard, I'm going to write it down. There's no pressure for me to do it in my head if I don't feel like I can. So we had kids with technology, Googling things and all sorts of stuff, but they knew that it was okay to do it as long as they were comfortable either way. We talked about communication. So this is Lucy up at the front. She'd come up with a theory about how she could do it. I think it was a multiplication in this, I can't remember, division. What did you do, Lucy? So she got up and she wrote down her steps. She explained it to the kids in the class. She answered some questions. Why did you choose this? Why didn't you choose that? She said, this is how I'm going to prove it to you, that what I've done works. So we had a really big, strong culture in the classroom of talking about, this is what I think, this is my theory, this is how I'm going to prove it. I had one boy who said, I've come up with a brand new multiplication strategy, algorithm. I said, you beauty. He said, here it is and it works. And I said, no, you got to prove it. So he went away and he said, for 3 days, I think he worked on it at home. For 2 days, it works, Kate, it absolutely works every time. And then the last day, it doesn't work. There was one, it didn't work. And I said, so what have you discovered? He goes, no, it's no good. I can't, it doesn't work. If it doesn't work once, it doesn't work. So we did a lot of proving, a lot of, it's okay to have a theory, it's okay to get it wrong, because then we've all learned something. So we did this more, we kept doing this, going back to, does my answer make sense? So, for example, kids who are doing some complex calculations, when you get to the end, check in, does it make sense? Does it look right? Does it sound right? Is it what you were expecting? If it isn't, were you expecting the wrong thing, or have you done something that you need to go back and look at? So here again, some examples of the kinds of things that we talked about. Manageable, real life, over and over and over, and they come up all the time. You know, Miss Twigden said, come back in 10 minutes. What time is it now? When will you have to go back? All those kinds of things. So I think, as you were saying, slowed things down a little bit and really pulled apart, and everywhere we did, what's the mathematics in this thing that we're doing? What maths do you see? What do we need to do? We use the thinking questions over and over and over, all the time. The kids became fluent with the questions, and they would say, oh, they are. I have to. When would I write it, do it in my head? Would I do it on paper? All those questions. They were fluent with them. They asked them to themselves. They asked them to each other. We had them up on the wall. They're the questions. I understand what I'm doing. And they used accurate mathematical language, which Leanne was talking about, that consistent language. So we were, using digits, numerals, number names. I was learning too, so it was interesting. We had lots of conversations. Kate, you said number, do you mean numeral? Yep, that's what I mean. Thank you very much. So it was good, and that it was comfortable for them knowing that I had misconceptions or misunderstandings or used things that confused them. And I had one boy who said to me, I said, do you know what I mean when you know what I mean when I say this? And he said, well, I don't know, because you say that, but someone else says something different, and she said something different. I probably do know it, I just don't know, because you're not calling it the same thing. So that accurate mathematical language was hugely important for us. And for me, as a classroom teacher, working with the mentors had a huge impact on my capacity to intervene for all kids, because I feel like I understand what I'm doing, I've seen it working for kids who feel much more comfortable to say, Kate, no, I think you might be wrong, or I think I might be wrong, or I think they might be wrong. Let's explore. So that culture of acceptance, I think, has been huge. I now run lots of little learning groups. It might be, you two guys, come down here for 2 minutes, because I think what is happening here is this. Lots of those pull out, pull in, right now I see it, or I'll stop and I'll say, anybody not get this part about, an end? Right, come on, let's sit down here for a couple of minutes. And then off they go, and then you can check in, and I find that a really helpful way to keep an eye on what's going on. The mentoring's allowed me to continue in that same model, which I wasn't working in before. And it's interesting because it's overflowed into other areas, not just mathematics, but everything. It's that real explicit stuff. Let's all be learners together. Let's talk about it. Let's try it out. If it's not right, that's okay. That's why we're here. If we knew everything, what would be the point? So my confidence to know what students need, how to ask the questions, and the ability to teach. Because I think perhaps I thought before, kids will get it if I do it, explain it like this. But lots of times they don't. You have to really pull it apart, do it over and over again, and then I guess what I thought was explicit wasn't, is basically, I guess, what I'm trying to say. I think that's me.
Kate, can I just ask a couple of questions to link back to some of the things I was wondering about this morning? I heard Leanne talk about strong leadership action was to get some whole-side agreements around what you wanted to happen, and then the wave one action was around mentoring. Did you get told what to do, or did you have a choice? So that aspect of mathematics you've been talking about there, was that the bit within the whole-side agreement that was important to you?
Yes. I mean, we all talked about what was important, but it was what I had noticed. I think that
So your data set let you know that was the thing so it was about your capacity to craft that learning, I guess, is what I was wondering. And I was wondering around the agency, because you talk passionately about it. So that notion of you had agency over that decision?
Yes. And I was able to work with the mentor, email lots of questions, and I did feel quite unsure, I think, perhaps in the beginning, and my knowledge of curriculum didn't feel so strong. All those things that I've just, in the end, it was about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it, but also what was working for the kids in the class. So it's been fantastic for me. It really has. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I guess the conversation for us is that all of our teachers have a different entry point. And so the professional learning that we've been doing across the whole school has been with a view to us having that consistency of practice. But the work that we have done parallel to that whole school professional learning is very much the mentor model, and we've been embarking on that over the last 2 years. And a group of teachers opted in the first instance, and we had a representative from each year level team who worked over 12 months with that mentor and had opportunities to talk and plan, and then to be able to work alongside that person in their class. This year we've continued that, and different people have been identified, again an opt-in, and we certainly had a bigger take-up this year. We certainly had people demanding that they had the same opportunity that the other teachers had last year. And the way that works is that then, as teams, the teachers who have been working with the mentors work with the remainder of their team and share the work they've done. They've videoed sessions that mentors have been involved in, and then looked at those and reviewed them and worked on aspects that they can pick up with their classes. Our next level, I guess, as a result of that, and knowing that teachers are coming in at different points, and therefore we've got children who are being exposed to different things, we identified that there was a need for some of that Wave 2 intervention. And that came about as a result of the work we'd done as a whole staff around processes of counting and calculating. So term 3 of last year, we ran some audits with our children in our years 3 to 5 and had a focus on what gaps there were in that rules of counting. From that, Kerry and our other SSOs began working with those children with very identified aspects. This year we decided we would look at calculating thinking questions, and we did that with a view to looking at our year 3s to 5s and the need for them to be fluent to be able to access NAPLAN. So the work that we did in the build-up to our NAPLAN Early This team was our year 3 to 5 children, on those processing and problem-solving aspects. The interesting part was, and Kate would be testament to, she's working with year 4 children this year. She's had children coming from 3 different classes. The year 3s that came to her were from 3 different classes. Her observation is that one of the classroom teachers worked with a mentor across last year in the year 3. The children that have come from that class absolutely are fluent in those calculations. It was very obvious that the children from the other classes who haven't had that ongoing support and learning were the ones that we needed to focus on. So, the data certainly showed us where we needed to head.
So as Leanne touched on, we decided with our Wave 2 intervention with the kids that we came across to focus on our year 3s and our year 5s as a quick little, bang for our buck, I think the terminology was used earlier, to give them a 4 or 5 week, 30-minute sessions to get them up to speed and to be able to access NAPLAN. We did that by working with the mentor from PMA that we've been working with, and they produced an audit for us, and this audit ran through 13 or 14 all calculating type questions, all different operations needing to be used, all different areas of thinking that needs to be used, just to see how they went. This was delivered by the classroom teachers to all year 3 and all year 5 students, and then brought back to the SSOs, and we looked through them and marked them all. What we found, for each audit there was a marking process. It wasn't just a right or a wrong, it was broken into sections, and those sections covered, did they pull out the right quantities out of that question? Were they seeing that there were 4 different quantities that they need to work with, or were they missing one? So if they're missing one, everything down the track is no longer, it's just not going to work, basically. Did they get the quantities, but they weren't quite sure of the operation? They weren't understanding the language of the question, that it was going to be a subtraction or a multiplication or whatever it needed to be. Did they get those 2 steps, but then there was an error in carrying it out? So we colour-coded everything. Basically on this one, what we did was the pink is they weren't pulling out the quantities. So student A there on the left-hand side, they're with it. They know what they're doing. A couple of little mistakes. Student B, we've got a few areas where they're not pulling out the quantities once or twice, but they're really falling down and carrying out that operation and carrying it through to the end point. Student C is our quantity-focused student, that for each question, they're making little mistakes along the way. And it could be a variety of reasons. Some of them could be the language of the questions, the worded questions, they're not quite understanding. They can't read the numerals, the digits, whatever it was. So with our PMA mentor, we decided to focus on the students that were coming up with the quantity errors, because if we're not getting quantities right, the end result's not going to be right anyway. So by focusing on the quantities, what it allowed us to do was help the students unpack those questions, pull out what they needed to, then focus on, right, what are we going to do with it? Ask those thinking questions that they fluent with. Do I need to this? Do I need to that? And then work through them all. Having 70 or 80 of these laid out in front of you is a little bit daunting at times to figure out where to go. So what I did in each class lot is basically plotted it and colour-coded it. I am a bit of a spreadsheet geek. I do like being able to see data up there like that. But what this showed us, lots and lots of blue, lots of incorrect quantities coming out of that classroom. Fair bit of error in carrying out the operation as well. That's something we feed back to the teacher, saying, we've got this chunk here, this cohort that's really struggling. Question 8 was a particularly tricky question for that one, by the look of things. That's what we're going to focus on. Then we pulled out the students who had 3 or 4 errors across the board with their quantities, and they're the ones that we chose to work with. So for me, I worked with, this was a year 5 class. I worked with 2 groups of 4 students. Some of them just had a few gaps. Some of them do have broader range of learning issues, but anything's going to help, right? And I saw them for 3 sessions of 20 or 30 minutes a time. So what intervention looked like for us was pulling apart that audit that we got from PMA, and I basically rewrote every question half a dozen times or so, different scenarios, different quantities, different numerals, but same operational base. So they could get their mindset into that, right, what's the pattern here? What do I need to do with it? How do I solve it? What's the pattern? So different numerals for them to work with, but trying to identify those patterns that crop up every single time. A little bit, as Kate said, you know, real life situations. These guys want new skateboards. They have to walk home from their friends' houses. They eat the mini muffins from the canteen. So giving it to them in real life situations, stuff that they understand, rather than throwing a bunch of numerals at them that they go, oh, you know, it's just numeral, digit. They can't. But if we can sit and unpack it, right, who's got a watch on? What time is it now? What time is it in 20 minutes? Think about this in the question that so-and-so has to walk home. If you think about your watch being on that time, or if they've got an analogue one, look at the clock on your iPad, on your whatever you've got. So we work through everyday situations, pulling out the quantities that we needed. Are you sure? Are there any more quantities? Does this matter? Does that matter? Because sometimes in questions, there are quantities that don't matter. So we need to unpack and recognise the ones that do matter, that we need to work with. So we work through these, and again, like Kate said, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of practice. And there were some light bulb moments for some of them. There was the, that's what I've been doing wrong. Yep, great. Then there were others saying, I still don't get it. That's okay, we'll come back to that. So it's just that constant. What we found after the 4 or 5 weeks we had in the lead up to NAPLAN is, with the little cohort of kids that I specifically work with, I again rewrote the audit that was given to us by PMA. So it was almost the identical test, just with different scenarios and numerals and quantities involved, but same, again, operational base, to see how they fared compared to their first one. And what you'll see on this is the top, for the 8 students that I worked with, loads of blue, loads of, I'm not pulling out the correct quantities each time. I don't get it. I'm not seeing them. I can't find them. I'm missing one. I'm including the one that didn't matter. Second, post-intervention, I was thrilled to see there was not much blue at all, which is great. There is still some errors in carrying out the operation. Fine, we can work through that, and that's the stuff that we then can feed back to the teachers as whole class. Go back to that wave 1 intervention, that's whole class learning for them. Because what we found is, in the original audit, if they did make some mistakes in the quantities, there was generally also some operational stuff, but maybe I should have split cells or something. But the difference in the colour coding made it just really stand out and kind of hit you in the face. Went, oh wow, that was our bang for our buck. That was our short, sharp and shiny intervention, which made NAPLAN hopefully a little bit more accessible for them. So where to next?
As Kerry said, the audits that were used to identify the children for Wave 2 intervention were then once marked, given back to the teachers, and the work then for the teachers was to identify what they could work on back in class as the Wave 1. And again, I think the story that's come through here for us is that it indicated that many students were not fluent with those thinking questions. And for a school like us, where the focus absolutely needs to be on intellectual stretch for all, what we were finding is that our children were in a situation where they actually couldn't show that they were achieving beyond a C level. And so the work that we need to do is to absolutely be very clear about those gaps, knowing that a 4 or 5 week opportunity to be able to work with someone very clearly and very targeted and very explicit intervention, we can absolutely close that gap and give them the opportunity to be able to certainly show that they're achieving far higher than what we've given them the opportunity to do in the past. the interesting thing from that was we have been very strategic this year in that year 3 to 5 area. We've had quite a change of staff. We've identified through our selection process some new staff members and also put staff in that 3 to 5 area that haven't worked there before. And one of the new teachers, as a result of the audits and the information that she saw from her class, she was quite alarmed and came to me and was really keen to then connect with the mentor. Although she hadn't been identified for this year, she was really keen for that mentor to come in and work alongside of her to be able to address those very clear gaps. Where to? Where next? For 2018, very much our ongoing focus around the year 3 to 5 group, but particularly year 4s. Again, looking at those rules of counting, because as a school we've agreed that we're going to do that and continue to do that until that becomes a part of what our children from our ARTA 2 sector are able to come into our year 3 to 5s competent, so that then they can be addressing the curriculum that is in the year levels for those children. As I mentioned, I did mention this earlier, the cohort, the interesting for us was that the cohort of children who have been working very closely with mentors and the work that the teacher's been doing, that absolutely has shown a difference in those students. I think that's probably it. Thanks, Lisa.
Can I, just before we thank you, I reckon one of the connections that relates back to Gaynor's comment earlier around which people might not make because you're using a particular kind of language, but I think what you were calling thinking questions, they're the kind of things that are very strong in the proficiencies. And it might be something for you to think about. Number sense is not about having a set of mental calculation strategies. That's a small part of it. Number sense is often defined as the capacity to know what you called those thinking questions. So, and in fact, if we talk about numeracy is knowing, would maths help here? Which bit of maths would help here? And if you want to quantify, then having that set of thinking questions that are going to help you work out the quantities and go from there. So it's interesting to think about from your point of view, if number sense is something you've gone after, have you gone after the layer that's about having the strategies or the layer that's about having those thinking questions? Because it's obviously paid off for your side in lots of different ways. Can I welcome Deb, Emma, Josh and Amy from Cowandilla Primary School and invite you to share in their story.
My name's Deb Postuma. I'm the Deputy Principal here at Cowandilla Primary School. Today we're going to share the journey that we've been on for the past several years and the journey that's still going and changing and evolving term by term, really. So maths improvement's been a really long-term goal for us. For many years we've had a whole school approach to literacy and language, and we've been really strong in terms of the pedagogy and bringing in expert consultants to support that we knew everything we could about language, and knowing that will, help our students in the long run. We got to thinking about maths and we thought, we were asking ourselves the question, did our teachers know how math works? Our teachers know how language works, do they know how maths works? And digging into that a little bit more deeply, did people know how number works? So we sought an expert in maths, someone who could coach and mentor us and lead staff in their learning. We've worked with a consultant before in language, so we wanted to match that and have the same thing happening with number and maths. Our start was a Wave 1 focus, so an intervention to improve the practices of all educators. We worked with teachers and with our SSOs. We dedicated much of our staff meeting time to this. We had our consultant lead sessions over a couple of terms, so it was a real commitment in terms of time and learning and thinking for everybody. And the aim with that was to improve our understanding, to learn the maths knowledge and language that we needed, and then to develop the craft of teaching that. We introduced an intervention program also, and that was focused on getting the spike. So you would have heard a similar story a little bit earlier there. We wanted to shift children who were just below where they needed to be to where they needed to be. We wanted the intervention to be short, to be targeted, and to lift those outcomes. As a site, we knew we needed to resource this if we wanted it to be effective. We targeted 2 of our clever SSOs, and we put a commitment to time and energy into having them, committed to that program to be learning, so that could be a sustainable thing for us. So I'm going to hand over to Emma Williams, who is one of the 2 SSOs who's been leading the intervention program for us for several years now, and she'll talk about the what and the how of how that works here at Cowandilla.
My intervention co-worker and I started the maths intervention at Cowandilla in 2015. Under the guide of a mentor and with the support of management and staff, a target group was selected and we began. Jackie and I spent some time preparing ourselves in terms of resources, language and knowledge before we started with students, so we were equipped to intervene efficiently and effectively. This preparation was vital to the success of the first iteration of the program. Our role includes the collection and recording of data, timetabling sessions with target students, and most importantly, working one-to-one with students. Cowandilla decided the George Booker enumeration test was a good initial test to identify where intervention was required. George Booker has a test A and B, easily allowing us to track intervention progress. The enumeration test covers topics from language to symbols, counting and rounding to place value and renaming. We matched the George Booker test against the Australian curriculum criteria to determine which students were in our target group. As you can see, the data is presented in a way that clearly shows areas of focus, and in conjunction with the Australian curriculum, students requiring intervention are easily identified. The goal of the intervention is to select students who show that they are just below where they should be, those who require a push, who have gaps in their maths knowledge, and with some intensive intervention would improve quickly, getting bang for your buck. Once students are selected and their individual areas of need are identified, we have devised our own pre-tests. These highlight where a student is at on a specific topic and where we should begin. Jackie and I both have a bag of resources ready to go. We are also fortunate enough to have iPads which we have personalised with apps, so we can work with students wherever there is space available. For example, if a rounding question asks a student to round to the nearest 10, the number line is a useful tool that helps to show where the number's position is in relation to the decades. Another example, if a student is required to show how to make a number using different materials, they are provided with pop sticks and bands, MAB blocks, or they can use the app Number Pieces. Once we believe a student is confident enough on a topic, we have devised worksheets to prove to both the student and us that they are ready to move to the next topic. We move through this process until we have covered the areas requiring intervention, and then the students complete the second George Booker enumeration test. This provides us with pre- and post-intervention data. Some students require intervention for a week, some for a few more. Progress of the students is personal, and that is key to our intervention success. We have tried small groups and pairs, but we have found, in order for bang for our buck, one-on-one provides the best possible outcomes. We have created a program over time that is simple in its execution. The key is time and patience. The biggest learning curve for Jackie and myself was to talk less and ensure the student is holding the pen. We give students the time and space to show us what they know, and with the right resources in the right environment, develop their mathematical knowledge further. When we talk less, students can find their own voice and come to understand maths in their own way, in their own time, becoming confident enough to ask questions, reinforcing their learning. Each term, we evaluate and discuss the results with management, tracking students and looking where to next. We've had a strong focus on numeration as it is the basis of computation and number sense, and have consistently begun the year with this as our focus in Years 3, 5 and 7, shifting to Years 4 and 6 during Term 2. We've also spent time on number plans, recall of number facts and calculation. We've tracked students over the years, and it has been interesting to discover some of the trends. The students who tend to fall back into the target group the following year have generally retained some of their knowledge and require a shorter time in the intervention, allowing for other students to move through. The students qualifying is increasing. We're getting more students through in the same amount of time due to the whole school's approach to maths intervention. More students are receiving intervention, remembering the intervention's goal is to focus on students who need a push. It has been and continues to be a successful program because of the school's commitment. Jackie and I spend 26 lessons per week with the intervention. Each student receives 20-minute sessions 3 times per week, one-on-one intensive support, and the results speak for themselves. These students are becoming more knowledgeable and confident in the maths we focus on and thrive on the one-to-one teaching opportunity they receive. Students are benefiting from the changes in the classroom pedagogy, and with a little assistance from Jackie and myself, they are moving through the curriculum with more confidence and a greater understanding in mathematics. Thank you.
Emma, I told you that. Just one question. If I was listening to that,
Yes.
I might have thought, because that's quite a lot of children continuing to come through.
Yes.
I'm just not sure, not everyone might be aware that Cowandilla is an intensive English language. So lots of those, I guess I wanted you just to go back to, I heard you say something about the children who come on the program are not coming, they're not the same ones coming back. So you have lots of children in it because you've
Yes.
got lots of children coming into your NAP program who
Yes,
then,
coming
right.
into the school. Yes, that's right.
But for the children who do involved in that intervention, you're seeing significant growth.
Absolutely, yes. And sometimes they do come back to us, but it's for a much shorter amount of time, and they just need a little probing and need to reignite some of those ideas and ways of thinking that perhaps...
So a bit like Kerry's story around the first intervention picks up one wave
Yes.
of, not wave, that's a bad word, it's one of some of the aspects they need, and then you're able to go back down to make them even more powerful.
That's right, absolutely.
So are you picking up as many, because I guess that would be interesting. Are they coming in at the same level, so you're actually doing that same piece of mathematics over and over again, or are you now dealing with different pieces of mathematics?
It's usually different pieces of mathematics. And some students will just need a conversation. They will have, like you were saying, they've pulled out the wrong data or they've just made a silly mistake and they just need that reiterated from what they had forgotten before, or just that little push.
Cool. Thank
just
you.
to remind them of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. And I think, as Emma said, we've got over 20 lessons a week that we've dedicated to this intervention program. And the beauty of that time is that Emma and Jackie can have those quick conversations with teachers when kids are coming in and out of the program on particular days, saying, oh, they got this really well today, or they just need a bit more of that here and there, or I've gone over this again with them today. So there's those little bits of communication that can happen often because there's so much time dedicated to the program. And I think, that's a really important part of it, because teachers are kept up to speed with what's happening, as well as the data that Emma and Jackie keep, you could see is really tight and rigid, and it's fantastic stuff. So we use that as our reference all the time. So alongside the intervention program, and using all the data that is a lot of the pre-test and post-test data, which is done with the intervention kids, but then we would do whole class testing also. We started to get a picture of across a range of year levels, and we were starting to see where students were retaining knowledge and where our focus for teaching needed to be. So we sort of came back to looking at bunches of areas where kids were not retaining stuff, and that sort of made us think this is more of wave one focus again. We need to go back to sort of where we've come from. Not exactly, but in a different way. Particularly with the processes of counting, primary students were edging up in year levels and still not showing us that they had that knowledge solidly and internalised. So we decided to take a focus with in-class mentoring. So we work at Cowandilla in year level partnerships. So most of our year levels have at least 2 teachers of like year levels teaching at the same year level. They don't teach together necessarily, but they plan and they collaborate. So we identified a couple of groups of those teachers to be mentored, and this was to be over an extended time with regular and consistent coaching from our consultant. So the coaching took several forms. Firstly, there was meeting and planning with the consultant during knit time, or if there was release time available, to further build an understanding of the counting system. Then the next step was the in-class modelling and demonstrations by the consultant. So we'd put the 2 classes together, so both teachers were accessing the demonstration and they were having a shared experience, which meant that they had consistency and clarity of the message that was needing to be internalised. So following that, conversations took place after the demonstration with the mentor to discuss the lesson, to talk about what was important to take away, and to work out what the teacher's next steps were from there, because they needed to carry the work on when the consultant wasn't with us there. It wasn't about always doing it and waiting for that person there. where do I go before I'm back? This is what you need to do, or this is what we'll work on, and we'll see where we get to by the time the consultant's back again. So that cycle of committing knit time, working together in classes and following that up after with conversations and planning was really critical to the cycle being successful. And two of our teachers, Amy and Josh, are going to talk to you about how that worked, because they've been part of the coaching model for quite a while now, and they're probably our experts in it, so I'm going to hand over to them.
Hi everyone, so I'm Amy and this is Josh. As Deb mentioned, we're just going to give you a bit of a snapshot about how we teach, manage and assess our maths, in particular number and the processes of counting. So I'm a Year 2-3 teacher this year and Josh is a Year 1-2. We've been working on the processes of counting teaching sequence with our maths consultant for 3 years now. We've found many successes in this approach. We've worked closely with an expert mentor as well as learning from colleagues, collaborative conversations and observations.
So firstly, we'll share how we structure our program. Whilst each class is unique and have varying year levels, the core focus of mathematical language and knowledge stays the same. We each teach 5 daily mathematics lessons, all of which are at the beginning of the day. We find this is the best time to explicitly teach this language as students are focused and engaged. We begin these lessons with a 15-minute daily number routine, which use real-life focuses and repetitive opportunities for practice. Throughout our lessons, we focus on explicit and consistent mathematical meta-language, which we transfer across all lessons. We often refer to this as talking like a mathematician. Throughout this process, we are powering up and powering down this language, giving them access to the everyday terminology, but referring back to the technical vocabulary. We do this until we reach a point where students are fluent and are able to use this language in and out of context. As this occurs, we slowly release the handover to students so they are able to take ownership of their learning. All this language that is used is consistent with the Wave 2 intervention language, so students who are involved in these programs are getting a consistent approach in class. One of the most important aspects of the successful implementation of the processes of counting is how our classrooms are structured, organised and managed. Access to resources is critical, and organising them in relation to focus areas allows for quick access and smooth transitions from one to the next. It also allows for Classrooms SSO to work with students who we identify as needing targeted support on a specific learning area. In terms of how I assess the process of counting, this year I've implemented visual learning points in the form of checklists. I've worked with students around how what each checklist means and how it supports their understanding of what their next learning point will be. These are critical in identifying students who need support and also identifying students who need to be extended or pushed. For students who are needing support, SXOs are quickly able to identify what learning point they are at and where they are needing to be moved to in their learning.
So yeah, as Josh has mentioned, structure and organisation of resources is critical for these lessons to run smoothly. So I organise my classroom in a similar way. Each learning area is organised into a box relative to the processes of counting and the different rules associated with that. I've got smaller kits which have been put together for SSOs to use within small groups of students who need extra repetition of an activity and in some areas as well. I also ensure that mathematical language taught is visible on posters and that makes for easy referral. So I monitor and track assessment of the processes of counting a little bit differently using a pin-up board. It clearly outlines the 3 counting rules. As students become fluent in an area, they move their name further along the chart to the next learning point. I differentiate my teaching and my learning activities according to these learning stages. And I also refer to this chart as I'm teaching so that students understand which area they're learning about. So when reflecting on our practices, Josh and I have observed many successful outcomes as a result of our whole school commitment and approach to mathematics. This year we've noticed that students who have been exposed to this explicit and sequential teaching approach are showing visible and increased knowledge and understanding of number. Within my current classroom, I'm noticing that students who've had multiple years of learning through this approach are able to move through the processes of counting at a faster and more successful rate, and we're able to move on to processes of calculation earlier than in previous years.
So we have observed student language is clear and explicit in and out of context. Students are actively engaged in mathematical thought processes and not just simply learning maths during maths lessons. They are learning to view the world through the eyes of a mathematician. They understand maths is used to solve everyday situations and enjoy being challenged to do so. Finally, the importance of in-class mentoring has had a profound effect on our teaching practices and approaches. We have both worked hard and have been challenged to change our own mindsets to mathematics and have had our own learning journey. While it's difficult at first, it has been extremely rewarding to see the result in student achievement and engagement.
So you can see the work and the preparation and that's built up over the several years I've been working with Lisa Jane. So we're continuing to work through the coaching process with our staff in groups of teaching teams or pairs, and we're aiming for consistency of practice and language across this aspect of maths. And as our teachers have said, they're noticing that they're able to move through the content at a faster pace than they have been previously. So the coaching of teachers is targeted and it runs for approximately 2 terms. So we give people a whole half a year there with regular visits and demonstrations and feedback and all of that sort of thing. We are seeing the consistency of practice at a deep level. It looks different in classrooms. You can go to rooms and see one thing happening here and something else happening here that looks completely different. But we know that there's consistency of pedagogy and consistency of knowledge and consistency of language across our site. And we can see that the knowledge and skills of the students who've been exposed to this process of counting from an early age is really impacting as they hit that primary years band. An integral key to the implementation has been resourcing. You would have seen from Amy and Josh's slides. All our SSOs are trained and work in class, as you heard Amy say. Effective classroom implementation also requires a huge amount of physical resources to be produced. We try to be strategic with the way that we do this and be clever with our use of time. We wanted to remove the barriers for our teachers so that they can get on to the business of teaching and not be worried about, I can't do this step because I don't have this set of resources. So we just say, what do you need, where you're at? We either borrow it from other classrooms or we're clever in how we get our SSOs or others to help us get that stuff produced. A lot of our SSO time at Cowandilla is in class with students. We make a point of that, and so teachers are really clever at targeting that SSO support for students who need it, whether that be a comment from Emma or Jackie about the intervention program that might need a little bit of tweaking, or something that a teacher's seen from their maths class lesson. When an SSO comes in later, they'll say, can you work with this student on this aspect or this activity? They just need to do it again. As Emma said, we're seeing a shift in the intervention program. The complexity of intervention that's needed is moving, and that's a good thing. And that work is ongoing. Class teachers generally say they're learning new ways to teach and talk maths, so the language and the way they do it. And across the school, we have people at very different stages of automaticity and of comfort with the way we're teaching maths. But our teachers are persistent and committed, and they work together. They work in team meetings, they work after school, they talk throughout the day, and they share and learn from each other. They put themselves out there to be observed and get feedback, and they love it. Seeing this happen so naturally and willingly is a really pleasing reflection of the culture that underpins our staff. Thanks.
I guess the challenge for you as a leader is that SAPA and CESA made a conscious decision to model that notion of being specific around intervention and targeted the 2 aspects from Numeracy First about developing number sense and developing generalising for abstraction. So I guess if your site data showed that spatial sense or measurement sense was the key aspect that your learners were needing intervention in, or educators and learners were needing intervention in, what are the elements you heard? So again, it's back to what are those leadership actions and what are the effective intervention strategies that can be transferred to your area. Rod, can I invite you to just make some comments around those 2 points?
I was just thinking the same thing. Listening to each of those, there was a story that was quite unique but connected. And one of the things I've found, and probably you have as well, if you try to replicate Belair or replicate Cowandilla or replicate Mawson Lakes, it never quite works. But each of those stories had some uniqueness to it. So I reckon it's really worth bringing some mathematical processes to that And if you look at the things that you heard in each of those stories and generalise them and look for patterns, what was consistent across all of those stories? What were you hearing that was pretty familiar and consistent? You know, some of those things were stood out. One of which stuck in my mind was there was a lot of talk about the things the children did involved real life or connected or interesting things. Because my experience in the schools I was in was often that the kids who were in wave 2 or wave 3 were often getting fairly boring, repetitious stuff over and over, and often what happened is we didn't see any improvement, but these were quite engaged. I heard a lot about whole school agreements, but also people having the capacity to work within them. So it's that sense of, you know, what were you hearing that was consistent right across the board or that really stood out to you? The second bit is, and Lisa just mentioned it then, is what were the leadership actions that sit behind that? Because that's the most critical thing for all of us in the room as leaders. An example of that, Lisa mentioned a lot about, we do people, we do someone, and then we move on to someone else. And often, and I know a lot of those that I used as principal were ones that I'd heard a school down the road used, or someone in my partnership was really interested and talked us all into it. My question is, as a leader in this field, in this area, how do you become a really critical consumer of what you want to do? So what I heard a lot in that is, this is what we wanted to do, and we got the people in and we structured it in a way that would work for us. We made decisions to achieve a particular purpose. So when you have a look at the patterns and generalisations across what you've heard today, go back in your tables and discussions and then think about what were the leadership actions that sat behind that. Resourcing was clearly one. Training was clearly another. But there's a whole range of other things. It was about getting the data to know where we are and to make decisions that are going to have the biggest impact. I heard a lot about short term being, let's go for 10 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever, and really do something that's concentrated and connected and interesting for the kids and then move on. Behind every one of those stories, there were clearly deliberate leadership actions as there were educator actions. So it'd be useful to unpick that. And I reckon the third level in that, if you had a look at what was working across all of them, what were the leadership actions that unpicked those, how do you create your story out of that for your site? Like, do you know really well, what the needs are of kids in your site? We heard a lot about number up there. So are there things in your site that you know, or do you need to collect more data in terms of audits and other things? Yep, we've got lots of NAPLAN data, but what about the other things that go into those other areas that aren't represented in NAPLAN data? Do you have that information? And how do you get that? So that sense of what did you hear, what were the leadership actions that underpin that, and how do you manifest that in your site and make it work, was what I was going to recommend.
So essentially what we'd like you to do, you may have chosen to gather those things on the piece of paper we provided, or you might have just chosen another medium to reflect as you were listening. We'd like you to give you some table time for about 10 minutes to have a talk out loud about. And I guess what we'd like to hear back from you at the end of that 10 minutes is, what's the top leadership action you heard? And maybe have 2 spare ones in case someone else flogs yours in the sharing process. And is there any key questions? In terms of questions about the specific sites, I guess what we were keen not to do was to focus in on how they actually did a piece. So the questions are not so much around a particular story. They'll all be hanging around for a little bit afterwards if you would like to follow up with that. That's why we're finishing at 11:30, so you have that opportunity. If you saw part of their story connecting to yours and you want to touch base. But I guess it's more around key leadership action, key question around intervention that's still sitting for you.
The question you were left with was, what was the significant leadership action and what questions about intervention? If we go to the leadership action, because that's why everyone's here today, because you've got a leadership role in some sense around this topic. So let's go to the leadership action first. Who'd like to start by sharing significant leadership action that they talked about?
I'm Jason Saxby, the Deputy Principal at Mulberry West, and I've been in that position for a week. So it's timely that I hear about intervention. I think that disposition is the important message that I got today. Going back and eliciting that from the students, and the way that people talked about that is pretty inspiring. So that's my direction.
We've been discussing the importance of the Wave 1, and particularly talking with our category of schools, that you can do all the work you want in Wave 2 and 3, but Wave 1's where you're going to get the shift, and recognising that and resourcing that.
It's one of the things I noted, the interaction between Wave 1 and 2 in a number of the stories as well. They weren't sort of static and separated, but each informed the other, which I thought was really good, and each was short term. People mentioned, now I'm going to forget the program. What's the program called? The Quick Smart. And when we first met with the guy who was in charge of that and developed it, he really emphasised quite clearly that it was for a very narrow band of kids for a very short period of time. And his anxiety was some South Australian schools were starting to expand the sort of kids who were going into it, and he worried that it would affect their statistics. So, but even in that one, it was just a very narrow group of kids, very short, and that's the story I heard too.
I'm Jess from Pimpala Primary, Year 1-2 teacher, and Richard, we talked about the training of the teachers was very important and having everyone on the same page, and I love the fact that the SSOs are included in that. They have to be. You know, a lot of schools cut them off because they're just SSOs, but for our school, you're not just, you are a teacher as well, and I think it was really nice to see that the commitment from leadership towards the mentoring and the training of whole school. So
They were truly whole school, weren't they?
whole school, definitely, yeah, and the kids were involved.
That's probably something that didn't come out in each of the stories, but I know from talking to them over there that there's probably a fourth voice that is part of that whole story. I think each of those sites has also focused on families. It wasn't your story that you chose to tell because it probably wasn't one that SAPA CISA asked you, but each side has also brought them into the loop as the fourth component. That be fair? Yeah.
And I think also the connected work of SSOs and teachers. They seem to be very connected in each of those stories and not sort of separate. People had their roles, but they were connected roles.
I think most of us have got lots of things running around in our heads at the moment, and it's actually quite exciting. I think we need to remember the importance of our teachers and their pedagogy in the classroom and deliver some of the essence of today. I think I'm excited by that. I want to type this up and just share lots of what I've heard today, and that we're not just going to throw out everything that we've learnt from Booker and natural maths and all those things that I'm seeing that people are using in their classrooms, and actually patting people on the back and saying you are actually doing a really good job because you are using a lot of those strategies, and keep looking about whether we are making a difference and how are we. I think our data, that's probably where we need to go back and have a look how we're going to collect that data. Do you really know how your children are learning and how they're thinking mathematically? The other one was probably our SSOs. I often talk to them about it's not about finishing that sheet. When the teacher sends you out into the corridor to work with that small group of children and they can't count one for one, the sheet goes to the side, you put those counters or those lollies on the table, and we're going to start looking at how we count one for one. Do we know that that's 2? Do we know that that's 3? And that's where we start. And I say to them, I give you permission to do that, to go back to the teacher and say, they don't understand how to do that. I've had to go right back. And I think then the next thing would be probably to share the strategies that are working in classes, build that capacity for leadership with our teachers who are doing some fantastic things and share that. And then my next thing would be to get some of our teachers out of the classroom doing their double knit, where they're working out where they're going to move furniture and how they're going to do that, and actually go and watch some of these wonderful teachers and SSOs in action.
And I think something you highlighted there that we haven't commented on yet is that, as we said, all those people we've ever done in the past have all got great things to offer, and they've certainly enriched people's pedagogy. Often, I think one of the strategic actions I heard from all 3 sites is that they took those things and connected them back to the Australian curriculum and to their learners. And I think that's not what you get in the doing culture. It's kind of sitting out here. It's about the connection between those things, valuing what people have done and the strengths of those, but then building on.
Hi, my name's Louise Barker from the Adelaide Prospect Partnership, SLIP. I'd also like to add TEFL in there as well, that we're being able to recognise the expertise that people bring into our schools as their deep pedagogical content knowledge in mathematics, and that we as leaders are able to build that bridge between what they're offering in that with TEFL and the Australian curriculum. I think that's our role, is to ensure that it's the pedagogy and the content knowledge that we're focusing on that happens to be brought in by people that have expertise in that, along with our expertise. So I think as a leader, that's critical. AC, TEFL.
In a lot of those stories, I heard the use of mentors and others who both had the expertise but the capacity to work alongside. And that seemed to be a characteristic I'm looking over here in all of those stories. And again, that comes back, and you talked about leadership, that comes back to, again, being the critical consumer. How do you use external people in a way that meets your site's needs and where you are and where you're going? Because some of the ones I've used come in with set packages that works for them, and there's some great stuff in them, but it doesn't quite fit what I need. There's nothing wrong with negotiating if you're getting other people, and this is what we need. Like, for example, that notion of mentoring, that the teachers I talk to at the moment are very strong on the impact that mentors have on them. So how do you do that with the people you have in? You know, so it's that critical consumerism and how you use it as a leader.
And I think it's also that lens of, which we were talking about earlier, the craft of being an effective mathematics learner and teacher with children. That involves, as Louise just said, both sides of the story. It involves me knowing the particular discipline, but it also involves me having a set of pedagogical questions, which is really what TEFL is. But it's also about me, I think it's also about stretching that as well. There's quite a few sites looking at TEFL 2.0, I guess would be one way to describe it, about, so if that's the set of pedagogical questions we have, 10 or 12 years later after they were written, what would be the new ones we'd want to add to that? If you're looking at Gen Z, how does that change that? And that for me is the dynamic part of what Louise was saying. It's that notion of continually stretching the what and the how to be able to meet the needs of the learners in front of us. One more, Julie, anyone else?
Yeah, Alex Narcissus from Grange Primary School. One of the things that really stood out for me as an important factor was deprivatising the achievement data and having conversations with students and showing the students exactly where they're at, where their gaps are, and yeah, taking the time to get that input from the student, and then I think they'd obviously have greater ownership over closing those gaps, and I really valued that, and I was glad to hear there was a story around that.
And I think I want to catch them afterwards because there's a couple of there I'd like to follow up. But I think I keep always coming back to personal and social general capability, Year 2 standard. A child would be able to say, this is what I already know, this is what I don't know yet, here's 2 or 3 ways I think I could learn my way forward, and then putting it into action and doing it back. If we're not making it transparent, like those 3 sites were, how are we going to actually achieve that aspect of the curriculum as well as the mathematics? So I think it's a really important, powerful part of the story they told.
The other leadership thing I think is the takeaway is, you know, what's your mental checklist as a leader you're going to take away from now? Because when you see intervention happening, what are you going to be seeing, how are you going to be evaluating it, and what are you going to reinforce or not reinforce? Because we do that all the time as leaders. And by leaders, I mean whatever role you have in terms of leadership, whether you're a classroom teacher who has a leadership role, whether you're a principal, deputy or whatever. And how has today potentially added some or shifted some of those 4 or 5 things you have in your head? Because that will do as much to advance where you want to go as anything else. What are you reinforcing? What are you looking for? And a quick example of that is, and some of you would have seen this, the Ontario Principals Association put out a whole lot of booklets probably 8 years ago, one of which was around mathematics. And they kept talking and saying that, you know, if you want to shift attitudes, dispositions and things, you also have to shift your teachers' attitudes as well, because otherwise they'll just keep going back to the old way. But they also said you have to shift your own as a leader. So when you think about this today, what's shifted in your head and how are you going to look for that, reinforce it and encourage it in your own side?
As we said initially, this was something that SAPA and CESA wanted to do together to start the conversation about intervention, and we'd encourage you to leave with that same breath in mind, that it's not about an intervention program, project or anything that starts with a P. It's about every breath we take and every action we make, and what it's about is deciding what's the most strategic action for you to take right now. Both our organisations would be really keen to know how else we could assist you. So if you've got some of those intervention, if there were questions about intervention just generally, we'd love you to drop that information on to the post-it notes. Or it might be that, as we said, we honed in today on intervention around number sense, generalising and abstraction. Is it about examples in those other areas? What else would our organisations be able to do to support you in that work? So, thank you again. Thanks very much to Cowandilla for acting as host. And I guess what we're hoping is that you've got some things to get you on the journey to having your intervention ducks in a row.